When the United States first confronted the German war machine in North Africa, it became painfully clear that sheer courage alone would not win the day. The Wehrmacht had already conquered most of Europe with frightening efficiency, its troops disciplined, its tactics ruthless, and its supply lines honed from years of war. American soldiers, many of them fresh from training camps, faced a stark awakening at the Battle of Kasserine Pass in early 1943. Outgunned, outmaneuvered, and untested in real combat, they suffered heavy losses, a humiliation that shook both the army and the public back home. Yet in that defeat lay the seed of transformation. Commanders realized that raw manpower was useless without coordination, intelligence, and logistics. Lessons were learned in the heat of desert warfare. Behind the lines, an equally important battle was taking place. While American soldiers struggled on the front, the United States mobilized an industrial might the world had never seen. Factories that had once made cars, refrigerators, and textiles were converted almost overnight into engines of war. Aircraft rose from assembly lines in numbers that staggered even the most optimistic planners. Sherman tanks rolled out at a pace that left Germany scrambling to respond. Every truck, every cannon, every crate of supplies was a weapon not only on the battlefield, but against the very fabric of German strategy. The German generals could see it clearly. Rommel wrote in his diaries of the terrifying productivity of the Americans, and even Rundstedt acknowledged that Germany was now facing an opponent whose potential seemed limitless. On the battlefield, change was coming fast. American officers refined tactics, integrating infantry, artillery, and air support in ways that began to neutralize the early advantages of the Wehrmacht. Young soldiers who had once panicked under fire began to hold their ground, inspired by leaders who refused to accept defeat. The desert became a classroom, each engagement a lesson in resilience and innovation. Stories began to emerge of audacious small-unit actions where squads of inexperienced men held off larger German formations through ingenuity and sheer determination. These acts of bravery were the first glimpses of what would become an unstoppable force. Meanwhile, German intelligence struggled to comprehend the scale of the challenge. American production was not just high, it was overwhelming. By 1943, the United States had produced tens of thousands of aircraft and thousands of tanks, all supported by a fleet of trucks that could move men and material faster than any European army could imagine. Germany still relied on horses for much of its transport, and the contrast was glaring. Every advance by the Allies felt like a surge of unstoppable momentum, and for the first time, German commanders began to sense that victory might no longer be theirs to claim. Back home, the American public watched in awe as their nation transformed. Young men trained, sailed, and fought, while a vast industrial complex churned out the tools of liberation. The once daunting Wehrmacht now faced a foe that combined raw courage with unprecedented resources. By the end of 1943, the American military had shed its initial naivete. Soldiers no longer stumbled, they maneuvered. Commanders no longer hesitated, they struck with precision. And the German generals, despite all their experience, could only watch in disbelief as a new kind of force rose from the deserts of North Africa and the factories of the Midwest. The awakening of American power had begun, and the world would soon feel the full weight of it.
While American soldiers learned the hard lessons of combat, another battle raged thousands of miles away in factories, shipyards, and assembly lines. The United States had transformed itself into what Franklin D. Roosevelt famously called the arsenal of democracy, a nation whose industrial power could rival and eventually surpass that of the entire Axis. Every city, from Detroit to Pittsburgh, hummed with the relentless rhythm of wartime production. Cars became tanks, typewriters became bomb sites, and ordinary men and women became the invisible soldiers of victory. By 1944, American factories were producing more than 300,000 aircraft, over 49,000 Sherman tanks, and nearly 2.4 million trucks. These were not numbers on a page. They were steel and fire that would crush the German war machine. The scale of production was staggering, almost incomprehensible to the German high command. While the Americans churned out modern vehicles and weapons, Germany struggled to maintain its mechanized army. Over 1 million horses still pulled artillery, supplies, and ammunition, a haunting reminder of how far behind the Axis had fallen in modern logistics. Speer, the Reich's Minister of Armaments, admitted in his memoirs that even with forced labor and desperate measures, Germany could not match American output. Rommel, who had once boasted of the Wehrmacht's unstoppable power, now expressed private worry that the balance of resources had shifted irreversibly. Every plane that took off from an American airfield, every tank that rumbled toward the front, tipped the scales further against the Axis. American ingenuity was as important as sheer numbers. Shipyards built Liberty ships at a pace that stunned naval experts, while engineers developed new weapons, from rockets to amphibious vehicles, that gave Allied forces unprecedented flexibility. Logistics officers created a web of supply lines that spanned the globe, ensuring the troops could move farther, faster, and better equipped than any army Germany could muster. Every advance on the battlefield was backed by a seemingly endless tide of men, machinery, and material. In contrast, German units often fought with depleted ammo, worn-out vehicles, and exhausted soldiers, their morale eroding as the war dragged on. The human dimension of this industrial triumph was equally remarkable. Factories employed women, teenagers, and retirees, all contributing to a national effort that blurred the line between civilian and soldier. The sound of hammers, presses, and engines became as familiar as gunfire, each note a testament to the nation's resolve. Soldiers on the front often marveled at the sheer scale of supplies arriving at their disposal. For the first time in history, an army could fight almost anywhere, sustained not by chance, but by a meticulously planned and executed industrial machine. Even as battles raged in North Africa, Italy, and eventually Western Europe, American production never faltered. The Germans could no longer plan around shortages or predict American capabilities. Each new offensive, each landing on distant shores, was supported by a logistical backbone that made it nearly unstoppable. American planes outnumbered Luftwaffe squadrons, American tanks could outgun anything Germany could field, and American trucks ensured that every advance was supplied, reinforced, and relentless. The reality of the arsenal of democracy was simple, yet terrifying. Numbers, resources, and ingenuity could win wars as surely as courage and tactics. By mid-1944, it was clear to both Allies and Axis alike that the tide of war had shifted. Germany's once formidable military was being worn down not just by battles, but by the invisible pressure of American production. Every plane flying over Normandy, every Sherman tank rolling through France, every shipment of ammunition arriving at the front was a reminder that the United States had become a force no enemy could ignore. The arsenal of democracy was no longer a concept, it was a living, breathing juggernaut, one that would carry the Allies from the beaches of Europe to the heart of the Third Reich. By the early summer of 1944, the Allies were ready to strike at the heart of German-occupied Europe. Months of careful planning, intelligence gathering, and logistical preparation culminated in Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious assault in history. On June 6th, D-Day, thousands of American, British, and Canadian soldiers braved treacherous seas, fortified beaches, and a hail of machine gun fire to storm Normandy. The Atlantic Wall, Germany's elaborate coastal defense system, was formidable. Concrete bunkers, minefields, and artillery threatened to turn the beaches into graves. Yet determination and strategy overcame fear.
Soldiers clung to landing crafts, waves crashing over them, their minds focused on the simple but impossible task of reaching the shore alive. The early hours were chaotic. Units were scattered, tanks sank under the weight of rough surf, and communications faltered. Yet amid the confusion, acts of heroism emerged. Officers and enlisted men alike improvised, overcoming the meticulously planned German defenses. By the end of the day, despite staggering casualties, the Allies had established a foothold. From that precarious position, the Americans began pushing inland, their momentum growing with every village and hedgerow captured. Normandy was not conquered in a day. It was wrested from the enemy inch by inch, each success powered by coordination between infantry, armor, and the overwhelming support of the air. Operation Cobra, launched weeks later, shattered the German defenses in the west. Bombing raids softened enemy positions, and armored divisions poured through the breach with astonishing speed. The American advance became a storm, moving faster than the German command could react. Towns and cities fell in rapid succession, supply lines were cut, and German forces were forced into desperate retreats. The human cost was immense, yet the Allies pressed forward, understanding that each mile gained was a step closer to liberating France and crippling Germany's hold on Europe. Along the way, individual acts of valor captured the imagination of soldiers and civilians alike. Audie Murphy, barely 19, became a symbol of courage under fire, holding off entire German units with machine gun and rifle. Stories like his inspired countless others, demonstrating that American resolve could match and even surpass German discipline and experience. Behind these stories, the machinery of war continued relentlessly. Tanks, trucks, and aircraft produced by the arsenal of democracy rolled into action, supporting every advance and keeping the momentum alive. German forces, by contrast, struggled to regroup, their resources stretched thin, their morale waning under the relentless pressure. The fighting was brutal, the terrain unforgiving, yet every battle revealed a growing mastery of combined arms tactics. Infantry, armor, artillery, and air forces operated in concert, exploiting weaknesses in the German lines. American forces adapted constantly, learning from every ambush, every counterattack, every obstacle in the way. By late summer, the Allies had liberated much of northern France, turning the once formidable Atlantic Wall into a shattered relic of Germany's ambitions. The speed and coordination of the American advance left German commanders scrambling, unable to predict or counter the surge of mechanized, well-supplied troops sweeping across the countryside. Every captured town and destroyed enemy position underscored a simple but terrifying fact for Germany. The Americans were no longer green, inexperienced soldiers. They had become a machine of war, powered not just by men, but by industry, planning, and courage. Each victory reinforced the idea that nothing, no fortification, no bunker, no entrenched unit, could stop the rising tide. Normandy had been the beginning, a test of skill and endurance, and the Americans had passed with determination that promised even greater triumphs. The destruction of the Atlantic Wall marked a turning point in the European theater, demonstrating that the combination of strategy, heroism, and the overwhelming power of American logistics could break even the most formidable defenses.
As the Allies pressed toward Germany in late 1944, Hitler launched one final desperate gamble, the Ardennes offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge. Dense forests, icy roads, and snow-covered hills set the stage for the last major German counterattack in the West. On December 16th, German divisions struck with speed and surprise, pushing deep into the Ardennes and creating a massive bulge in the American lines. Units that had been moving steadily across France suddenly faced an enemy determined to reverse the course of the war.
For many American soldiers, the winter forest became a crucible of fear, endurance, and courage, testing everything they had learned in the months of combat since Normandy. Communication lines were cut, supplies dwindled, and reinforcements struggled through snow and mud. Yet even in the chaos, small unit leadership and quick thinking proved decisive. American officers coordinated counterattacks, improvised defenses, and rallied troops under conditions that would have broken less disciplined armies. One story stands out. Major James Howard, flying above the battlefield, engaged 30 Luftwaffe fighters alone, buying critical time for embattled ground forces. Young soldiers, barely out of training, fought with extraordinary resolve, holding key crossroads and towns despite being surrounded and outnumbered. Every action, every stand slowed the German advance and kept hope alive. Meanwhile, the German army, despite its initial success, began to show the limits of its own strength. Fuel shortages, exhausted troops, and overextended supply lines hindered their advance. The very surprise that had given them an early advantage now became a trap. American artillery and air power, combined with reinforcements arriving from other sectors, gradually began to turn the tide. The Allies' ability to adapt quickly and concentrate forces at critical points demonstrated the maturation of an army that had once stumbled at Kasserine Pass. Every stalled German push, every counterattack repelled, underscored that the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. Amid the snow and blood, acts of heroism multiplied. Infantrymen took cover in frozen villages, tanks emerged from forest paths to strike unexpected blows, and engineers repaired roads and bridges under fire to maintain supply lines. German soldiers, facing relentless American firepower and increasingly coordinated defenses, began to falter. The Ardennes became a test not just of skill, but of endurance, morale, and industrial might. The Americans could replace losses, reinforce positions, and sustain operations, while the Germans could not. Each day of the Bulge demonstrated the widening gap between the two forces, a gap rooted in production, logistics, and the unwavering resolve of an army fighting on its own soil. By late January 1945, the German offensive had been fully repelled. Thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured, and the dream of a last-ditch victory in the West evaporated. The Wehrmacht had launched one final gamble and lost, and the consequences were catastrophic. German morale crumbled as the Allies resumed their advance, unrelenting and methodical. The lessons of the Ardennes, flexibility, coordination, and the integration of logistics and combat power highlighted the evolution of the American military. The once inexperienced soldiers of 1943 had become a force capable of absorbing shock, adapting, and striking back with devastating effect.
By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was crumbling under the relentless pressure of American and Allied forces. After months of crushing offensives, Germany's once feared armies were exhausted, outnumbered, and outgunned. Rivers, forests, and cities that had been the sites of fierce resistance now became corridors of retreat for soldiers who could see the inevitability of defeat. Every day, tens of thousands of Wehrmacht troops surrendered, overwhelmed not only by superior firepower, but by an enemy whose logistical and industrial might made further resistance almost meaningless. The Germans had once conquered Europe with speed and terror, but now they were being swept aside by a tide that could not be turned. The crossing of the Rhine in March 1945 symbolized the final blow. American forces, supported by thousands of tanks, artillery, and aircraft, surged across the great river with astonishing speed. German defenders, already weakened by shortages and exhaustion, could only offer token resistance before being overwhelmed. Cities fell one after another as Allied troops pushed deep into the heart of Germany. Every advance demonstrated the full power of industrial democracy, a combination of soldiers, machines, and supply networks that the Germans could no longer match. Each captured town, each destroyed bunker, each liberated prisoner highlighted the inevitability of the Reich's collapse. Individual acts of heroism continued to shine amid the destruction. Soldiers like Audie Murphy, who had already become legends, and countless others showed courage that seemed almost superhuman. Yet even the bravest could not stop the sheer momentum of the American advance. The combination of tanks, aircraft, artillery, and relentless infantry assaults made every defense fragile, every counterattack futile. German commanders, including Rommel, Rundstedt, and Speer, watched helplessly as their carefully built armies and fortifications were rendered powerless by the logistical, technological, and numerical superiority of the Allies. Their diaries and memoirs reflected disbelief, shock, and a growing sense of the end. By April, the collapse was accelerating. Soldiers surrendered in unprecedented numbers, sometimes as many as 59,000 per day. Entire divisions dissolved into the weight of continuous pressure, lacking fuel, ammunition, and morale. Civilian populations fled cities, caught between retreating armies and advancing forces. The once mighty Wehrmacht, which had terrified Europe for years, was now little more than scattered units attempting to survive. The pace of defeat was dizzying, a stark contrast to the rapid conquests Germany had enjoyed in 1939 and 1940. The industrial and military machine of the United States left no room for recovery or reprieve. Behind the front lines, the American logistics and production systems continued to function flawlessly. Trucks delivered food, fuel, and ammunition faster than Germany could deploy defenses. Factories continued to produce tanks, aircraft, and vehicles even as the final battles raged. Every American soldier on the front knew that their effort was backed by a nationwide network of industry and innovation. This synergy between industrial might and battlefield effectiveness turned every engagement into a test the Germans could not survive. Germany had been a master of blitzkrieg, but it could not withstand a war of attrition waged on an entirely different scale, one powered by steel, fire, and unending resolve. When the Allies entered Berlin, the end was clear. Hitler was dead. The Nazi regime had collapsed, and a continent that had trembled under German power was finally liberated. The story of America's rise from a humbled, inexperienced army to an unstoppable force was complete. It was a transformation fueled by courage, ingenuity, and the unmatched capacity of an industrial democracy. The Third Reich had been buried under an avalanche of steel, a testament not only to military strategy, but to the power of production, organization, and determination. History remembers the fall of Germany not only as the end of a tyrannical regime, but also as the triumph of a nation that combined the heroism of its soldiers with the might of its industry. From the deserts of North Africa to the Rhine, from Normandy to the streets of Berlin, the weight of American military and industrial power crushed a force that had once seemed invincible. The collapse of the Third Reich stands as a lesson in how courage, innovation, and relentless logistics can overcome even the most fearsome enemy, forever changing the course of history.